Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away
46, 56 degrees.
So thank you for coming tonight. My name's Toby Dogwiler, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography, Geology and Planning. And I've studied a number of things, my research and my interest over the years, and it all kinds comes together with water resources and climate change and how they interact with one another. And so when I was asked if I was interested in doing one of these, my first choice was I wanted to do the geology of Star Wars. But I guess the licensing is really a pain on that. So my second choice was Mad Max, to talk about the apocalypse and the science of apocalypse and dystopia in film. And I think this is a great series. It actually is even better than I thought it was once I started to think about this and research a little bit about the film and how it relates to these topics. So what I'm going to do is take you through just a quick timeline of Mad Max to talk about how the world ends up like this. And before I do that, has anybody ever read this book by Alan Weisman, The World Without Us? It came out a few years ago. I'm not sure when. It's been a while since I read it, but it really made an impression on me. The premise of the book, let's see, 2007, wow, that's 10 years. It seemed like yesterday. What really struck me when I read this book, and it does relate to this, is he takes the premise in here that all the humans are gone, just like that. He doesn't worry about why or how or what caused that. That's not his interest. It's how fast would things in the world, sort of all the man-made structures in the world, the cities, the buildings, how fast would they decay? How fast would they revert back to something a little more primitive? And he tackles this from many different angles, but one of the things that really struck me was he spent some time at Chernobyl, which of course had the big nuclear accident in 1986, so just over 30 years ago, just over 20 years when he wrote the book. And he talks about, has anybody seen pictures of Chernobyl since then? And it's been an amazing thing. I mean, it's full of radiation, but wildlife, the reserve that they've cordoned off to protect humans has allowed wildlife to thrive in that area. Of course, there's some side effects to that. The buildings have decayed rapidly because there's nobody there to maintain them. The vegetation's come back. And it turns out that a lot of the things that we think look pretty permanent don't last very long if there's not some people around taking care of them. It's a great book, and that's where I'm going to jump off here. And I've got a couple of sources that I read a lot of things preparing for this, but I thought this was a really good article. You can find it on the web. It's the economics of Mad Max and Star Trek. And so in films, whether it's Mad Max or any of the other number of movies that explore this apocalyptic or dystopian future, there's some common themes. Resources are exhausted, there's ecological disaster, usually it's some sort of ruins of war or you're in a war. This all leads to a breakdown of society, civilization, governments, and then we descend into a perpetual conflict. And so that's one view of the future. The other view is the Star Trek view. We're liberated by technology and innovation. If you want something, it just materializes out of the air. If you want a steak dinner, you just go up to the replicator and it makes it for you. So we live in a utopia of plenty. There's no conflict. There's a removal of limitations. And I think that both are interesting. I love both of these genres, the Star Trek movies and some of the other movies like that. But I think that one of the advantages that the Mad Max future is it helps us ask deeper questions. And this is more fun, and usually if we're fighting somebody, it's the alien species that are coming to get us, but we're not fighting each other. With Mad Max, or its other cousins of apocalyptic doom and dystopia in the film industry, we're often asking or exploring questions that are more relevant to us, I would argue often. Mad Max is the result of a lot of things going wrong in a world that happened before the movie started. How many of you have seen all 4 movies? A few of you. The first one is great. The second one's really good. The third one you can skip, and this one I think's good too. That's my opinion. I also, the Mad Max Wiki, Mad Max Wikipedia. So I tried to reconstruct a timeline. The movie's not based on a book. It was written by the director and somebody else. The director's first career in the 1970s was a medical doctor. He dealt with a lot of injuries that inspired him to a lot of the violence and injuries that you see in the movies. So I tried to put this timeline together. Because there's no book, there's no definitive story about what happened in the canon. Some movie universes, like Star Wars, there's a well-defined canon. And we know history that's not in the movies because of books and other things, but a lot of this has been put together by people on the Wikipedia for Mad Max based on interviews with the authors, catching very subtle things in the films. But pre-Mad Max, and Mad Max was set in about 1984, even though it was released in 1979. If you remember in the beginning, it says a few years in the future. But there had been a massive war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, destroys the Persian Gulf countries and infrastructure, basically destroys the oil, much of the oil production globally. That leads to inflation, gold prices skyrocket. That leads to massive bankruptcy, people lose their jobs, mass unemployment. That leads to bank runs, which cause economic collapse. That leads to riots in the cities, nation states are destabilized. So there's a trigger here, and the trigger mechanism that leads to the destruction of civilization is this war. Go forward. Help. Uh-oh. There we go. No, that's back. All right. Well, Mad Max, the next movie, or the first movie, set in 1984, and it's a few years after, it's in 1984, so a few years after this that presumably happens in the 70s. And in Mad Max, we're at a stage in society where this has all happened, but there's still some threads of civilization and law and society. They're really the last gasp. They're holding on. And Max starts out in this first movie as a police officer. They're trying to maintain some control in the cities, but largely losing the battle. There we go. It's set in urban Australia a few years from now. There's some hints in the movies and in the script that weren't information that wasn't in the movies, that this was in December of 1984. Fuel is in shortage. Governments are competing to control the remaining supplies, so there still is conflict. Max is a federal policeman. An interesting side note, the original story that they wrote, the original film that they tried to get made was more of a contemporary whodunit type of mystery type of thing, but they couldn't, they had just a few $100,000 budget, and because they couldn't afford to replicate the world as it is, they tried this dystopian future because that gave them more creative freedom. They could do what they want because they had more control. They could have Max wear fake leather for the police uniform, if you remember, instead of a police uniform, because they couldn't afford police uniforms. Between Mad Max and Road Warrior, there are some comic books and other sources out there. Electricity generation ends. Food and fuel become extremely limited. People start to flee cities because of the lawlessness. And then lone scavengers out there start to form gangs. And this is all set in Australia, but presumably the same things going on around the world. That leads us to the Road Warrior, the second film. It's said 3 years after Mad Max. By now, the economy's collapsed. People are out in the countryside. Marauders are in control of fuel and resources. Then in between Mad Max and the third film, Thunderdome, there's a nuclear apocalypse. So the remaining governments trying to control the oil resources that are left launch nuclear war on one another. Nuclear winter follows. During this period, Captain Walker tries to escape Sydney in a 747 with a group of people in search of civilization. They've lost contact with the outside, but he crashes and the survivors form a tribe. That's an important part of the third movie at the end, if you've watched it. During this period, the climate reverts back to hot and dry. Desertification expands. Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, made in the mid-'80s, was set about 15 years in the future from the first or the second movie, so we're in the late 90s. The nuclear winter has caused the scarce water to also become radioactive, which we saw a little bit in this movie about the poisoned water and so forth. Oil is unavailable or extremely scarce. By Fury Road, we're about 50 years after the apocalypse, so another 20 years. Mad Max really ages well through this series. Australia is completely desertified and civilization has collapsed, and marauding gangs are coalescing around leaders such as Immortan Joe. So we're starting to reform some civil structure in the form of, authoritarian crazy guys. So where I want to go is, we talk about climate change today, and we think about what could happen if CO2 emissions stay high and the earth warms. And a lot of that focus, at least in the popular media, they talk about global temperatures or temperature rise or global warming. But we talk about in my classes a lot, and if you go out and you read the scientific literature on this, probably the effect of climate change that's going to be most profound for the most number of people around the world and cause the most strife and potentially lead to wars will be the changes in precipitation. Because we change the climate, yeah, it gets a little warmer. Well, somebody spent a lot of time in Minnesota and moved down here, I don't mind a few degrees warmer. It's just a little less winter. Now, I'm making a little bit light of that. That has profound effects in some parts of the world. But I think for most of us, the most likely things that are going to affect, that are affecting our lives, are changes in precipitation. We already see this. We're having more of these mega storms. Just read about yesterday the big storm in Boulder, Colorado in 2013 caused 100 years worth of erosion in one storm. And those size storms are becoming more and more frequent. But it's not just the excess floods, it's the big droughts. Like California just went through a very serious 5-year drought that if it wouldn't have broken this year, could have gotten really bad as far as the water shortages that probably would have occurred in the next 18 to 24 months. So let's take that back. So how do you get from here to there? Well, I think everything has to go wrong. You don't end up in a Mad Max world from where we are now because a couple of things break the wrong way. It's that descent. In Mad Max, the trigger was the war in the Persian Gulf that causes oil to become limited, that destabilizes everything like we talked about. Eventually, that leads to conflict that led to nuclear war in winter, which was a common fear in that time period of when these films were made, the first three. I think if you made these today, you'd probably have, if we rebooted the series and started it a few years from now, we'd probably have some water shortage some year that leads to some conflict. That conflict escalates to a war between nation states. I'll show you a scenario in a second. And then those dominoes start to fall, lots of bad choices, lots of bad luck, and you end up in this doomsday. I'm not saying we're going to get there, but I think that's how we would get there. And I'm not the only one. The Pentagon and the military, part of their job is to look into the future and figure out what our threats to national security are. And since the George W. Bush administration, they've been putting out a pretty steady stream, at least 3 or 4 that I know of, and who knows what they write that's classified. This is just what's out there for you and me. Trends and implications for climate change for national and international security. Climate change seen as threat to this is an article about that. Climate change seen as threat to U.S. security. Now the Pentagon tells Bush climate change will destroy us. That's maybe a little hyperbolic at the time. That was written in 2004. But that was a 2004 report. I don't have a picture of it like that one, where they actually war gamed it out. And they looked at scenarios based on the best science available at the time, projected into the future. And they saw that probably one of the most serious threats globally is China's shortage of water. China's facing, with huge population growth, limited water resources. Their industrializations led to the pollution of a lot of those water resources. And the Pentagon people who studied this decided that one of the likely scenarios is that China gets so desperate for water, they start to look across their borders to Siberia in the north. Plenty of water, not many people. 10 time zones from Moscow, maybe hard to defend from a large army. And they look south to Southeast Asia, some of the the wetter areas down there, and South and Southeast Asia, and they start to send armies across the border to seize the water that they need. That could be the triggering event. I know this is on video. Toby Dogwiler is not saying there's going to be a war over water that's going to lead to Mad Max. But I'm just saying this is how you get scientifically to where Mad Max is, that you need a triggering event like this, water shortage, leads to conflict, leads to bad choices, bad luck, causes war, escalates, gets out of hand. There'll be many opportunities for us to stop that process before it leads too far astray, but I think that's the science of how you get there. And with that, they told me I should talk for 10 or 12 minutes and then answer questions or field discussion. So I'm trying to not talk anymore, despite being a professor. So what do you think? Somebody's got to say something. You see do you see the scenario I'm getting at, without trying to be hyperbolic? That, I don't want to be the madman saying it's all going to go to hell, but and we have lots of opportunities to address these issues. Yeah.
All right. Let's look at our current administration. Let's look at how they're basically turning, or seemingly turning, a blind eye to climate change facts, right? What, in your opinion, how badly will this handicap an already pretty bad situation?
My honest assessment of that, and I've done some reading on this, and I think that a lot of people are thinking hard about this right now, and there's honest difference of opinion about how significant it is. We like to believe in American exceptionalism, and I think in some ways we are. But in this regard, there's some global things going on that make our ability as a species to address climate change not wholly dependent on us. And there's a couple reasons for that. China seems ready to step up and take some leadership on this. I think because they see an opportunity to take the lead in alternative energies and develop markets for that and economics. So one of the biggest consequences of some of the things the Trump administration is doing is impeding or retarding our development of technologies that then we could sell to other people to, start the transition to greener energy and technology. The other thing, though, is the federal government's big and important, no doubt about that, but people sometimes ignore the state and local governments at their peril. California is kind of doubling down on what are already some progressive policies for climate change. Lots of other states are. And so I think we may see the leadership on climate change shift from the federal government to the states. And they may fill part of that gap. There's some things they can't do. But even one of our biggest the military has made huge advances over the last 10 or 15 years and has huge goals for transitioning away from fossil fuels where they can, because, and I don't think that'll be stopped by any administration, because they're doing it not because the Army's full of a bunch of tree huggers. I'm not saying the Army's anti-environmental. They're doing it for national security, because their ability to project force is more secure, more, you know, they're doing it as a way to make sure that they can project force where they need to. Yeah.
Okay, so you brought up like the water situation in China, and like I know we're like not trying to like make you seem like you're trying to predict the future of like what's going to happen, but like would a scenario like similar to that could happen in the United States, or is that like a China specific issue?
I've been thinking about and planning, and I've got some students who I bribed to be here, so they've heard this a little bit, but I've got a little scenario I go through at the beginning of my water resources class that's sort of a thought exercise along these lines, where I talk about what could lead to a second civil war in the US. And we talk about what caused the first Civil War in the US, and even in early 1861, what they had in the form of public polling, nobody believed on either side, the North or South, that we'd actually get war. We had been dodging that bullet for 50 to 75 years, you know, up till the Civil War, and nobody thought it would actually get to that. But you threatened the South felt threatened economically because slavery was the key to their economic ability. The plantations and those things only could make economic sense with that free labor, that enslaved labor. And so I think if something like this were to happen in the US, where the US either invaded somebody else, like we talked about China, or went to war with itself, would be the states that have and the states that don't. Think about where all the population growth has been. There's been this shift in population from the Northeast and the Midwest out to the Sun Belt, the South, the Southeast, the Southwest, and the Intermountain West. So there's been a shift in population from places that have water to places that don't in our country. And think about where's it growing? Las Vegas, the county that Las Vegas is in was the fastest growing county for about a decade in the 2000s and late 1990s. There's no water. Tucson, Phoenix, anywhere in California, just about. Texas has had tremendous growth. Even Florida, you don't think about Florida and Atlanta and those areas as places that are maybe threatened by water, but they have their own water resources issues. If you know anybody who's lived in Florida, my parents lived in Florida for quite a while, and you might remember a few years ago there was serious drought in the southeastern U.S. Atlanta was on the verge of panic because they have poor water supplies. They usually get enough rain, and as long as there's enough rain, the reservoirs fill. If it stops raining, they run out pretty quick, and they've had a lot of population growth. So anyway, the idea here is that these states in the upper Midwest and the Northeast, they used to have a lot of electoral power, a lot of electoral influence, are losing that as their populations leave and those electoral votes shift elsewhere, but they have the Great Lakes, they have good groundwater, they have good surface water resources, and the rest of the country gets really thirsty and demands those water resources. But by gosh darn it, we're not going to give it to them, will be the attitude from the areas that have it, because we need that water to grow the crops, to do the industry. And if you want the water, why don't you move back here? You can see where I'm going with this. I mean, it's a thought experiment. It's not real. And you could lead to conflict that way, where a small group of states feels outnumbered and bullied by the rest and retaliates. That's what happened with the first Civil War, or the only Civil War. But it could happen. And another good example, I think it's Guyana, which who knows where that is in the world?
South America.
Yeah, so you're not even sure. That's my point. But it's a country, assuming I've got the right country, I have a slide for this and I didn't put it in there, but it grows a lot of coffee. And right now it's a very stable government. It has a very stable government, but it's economics are very dependent on coffee agriculture. And about right now, 3/4 of the country or more is suitable for coffee, for growing coffee. But the projections over the next few decades with climate models show that about most of that area is going to become unsuitable or uneconomic for growing coffee. So maybe by 2050, 2075, that country is going to face serious challenges as they're very one-track economy, coffee growth, is threatened and maybe eliminated, and then they don't have anything to fill that vacuum. So they may go from a country right now that we don't even know where it is in the world, that's very stable. The reason we don't know where it is because it's very stable. We don't have to worry about it. How many of you knew where Syria was 10 years ago? Maybe a little more likely, but you probably didn't know what Aleppo was. We know about that now because it's destabilized, largely because of a drought. That was one of the triggers there, was drought that destabilized Syria. But this other country we're talking about, the coffee one, that could do that. Well, that has implications for us. We just got sucked a little bit into Syria last week, right? Whenever these things happen around the world, we at least have to think about getting involved. You know, and those are those sort of scenarios where we end up involved in a conflict, and if they're not well managed, can go downhill. Yeah.
My brother was in the service for many, many years, and he spent a very long period of time in the Middle East. And he said they may fight about the oil now, and I looked at him like he had three heads. But he said to me, what they're going to be fighting on later is the water, because there isn't any.
There's a lot of discussion for my whole career since the 1990s. People have been, like me, have been talking about that most of the wars in the 20th century were over resources, especially oil. At the root, they were conflicts over energy, oil, things like that. In the 21st century, the projection is a lot of conflict is going to be over water. It's going to shift to those resources, and Syria is the first example of that. And I'm sure we'll see more. Unfortunately, if you think people can get desperate about oil, imagine how they'll get about water. How much pressure a government may feel to do something to put water in people's taps. I think it's a very real possibility. Any other comments? I know it's late and people have to go to work tomorrow, so. Well, do you think, you know, I think that watching a film like Mad Max, maybe here to wrap up, is a fun film. If you haven't seen the first three, you should go back and watch them. You'll understand why Max has this craziness that he's fighting from the first, especially the first movie. But, you know, they talk about a future that isn't, what is this, like in A Christmas Carol? The ghosts of Christmas future. It's not a foregone conclusion, right? We have a chance to shape that future with our choices. So that might sound a little corny, but it is at least true. And these movies maybe give us a glimpse of what, if everything goes wrong, it could look like, and help give us some perspective about the choices we make now and the leaders we elect and the policies we set. So.
Something I kind of think about when I'm watching Mad Max is, you know, you talked about there was the war that kind of started everything. And I'm always kind of thinking about pollution from like bombs, like uranium and things like that, and how that would have affected the water and the climate and the soil, and seeing like deformities, you know, within some of the characters.
And the half-lives.
How does that like play into this film?
Well, I think that's a big part, because in the Mad Max universe, it's nuclear war that causes this, and that radiation's obviously affected, you know, the half-lives. They have the tumors, and they need the blood and all of that. We don't know the whole story about why that is, but presumably that's it. When you have global nuclear war, you're going to pollute the water. The fallout comes right from the atmosphere, pollutes water. Immortan Joe is tapping some deep water some deep aquifer, presumably, where the water in that aquifer's thousands of years, recharged thousands of years ago, and has been stored underground, so it's clean, and will be until it's used up, or until the modern recharge works through there, whatever that time it takes, but it could be hundreds or thousands of years. So the person who controls that resource controls things because it's a clean source. But surface sources, like where the crows were, they're easily polluted because the fallout gets them directly. Yeah.
What kind of radiation in Chernobyl, you know, like how Chernobyl, it's like really thriving. I mean, they can take the bones of a wolf that seems a little bit larger than it should be, and it's like got a lot of radiation in it, but you know, there's tons of greenery, everything seems okay. I mean, they're really thriving. What kind of radiation played a role in that, as opposed to what kind of radiation would play a role in, like, say, bombing and nuclear fallout?
One's a much smaller, and I'm not an expert on nuclear bombs or nuclear power, but I think that the catastrophe there was only there and much smaller in extent than a large thermonuclear bomb would be, especially a bunch of thermonuclear bombs. If we just had one bomb, it would be devastating to some local area or a region. I don't know, but one bomb probably wouldn't affect the whole world, right? We tested bombs in the atmosphere and underwater and underground for 30 years, from the 1940s through the 70s. Those bombs went off, and we can track, we still use some of the radioactive materials that fell out from that to track how old things are in the environment, like how old is water in this aquifer. If it's got certain elements that only come from nuclear testing, we know that it has to be at least in that age. If it's got none of that, then it predates that. So you pump water out of your well, and that's one way to tell if it's older than 50 years or not. So these things can be pervasive. Chernobyl is a science experiment that's ongoing about how much radiation the environment can handle. And you know, as you get out from that radius, the reserve that they've created, it's pretty large, and it goes out to where the soil is basically more or less uncontaminated or something like, right? But as you get closer, it gets worse. So animals and plants living a little further out may be just fine. They have short lives, but who knows what the accumulating bio effects are of that generation after generation. Or, you know, I don't know what's happening to the animals that live right in. Yeah, it's